All right, let's cut the crap and dive right into this shitstorm. We're talking about the British invasion, that time in the 60s when those cheeky wankers from across the pond basically took a giant piss all over American pop culture.
It's wild, right?
Fucking wild.
Like, before the Beatles showed up, America had a total monopoly on rock and roll.
They were the kings, man.
Right, exporting this raw, rebellious energy that British kids were lapping up, but their own bands just couldn't quite get it right.
Yeah, it was all a bunch of watered-down bullshit, like a bad cover band at a dive bar.
Exactly.
But there was this one dude, Lonnie Donegan, playing this skiffle music, whatever the hell that is. He actually cracked the U.S. top 10 back in the late 50s.
Donegan's a good example of how, even before the Beatles, there were these British artists taking American influences and twisting them, making them their own.
So it wasn't a total wasteland.
Right.
But then the Beatles came along and just blew the bloody doors off the whole fucking thing. How did these four lads from Liverpool go from playing pubs to conquering America?
Well, their songwriting was a huge part of it.
Catchy tunes, sure. But there had to be more to it.
Oh, absolutely. Lennon and McCartney were writing these incredibly clever songs that just got stuck in your head, but they also had this raw energy, this charisma that just oozed out of them.
And then there was the media hype machine, right?
The media went nuts for them. Beatlemania was already a thing in the UK, and when they landed in America, the press just went into overdrive. Magazines, newspapers, TV specials, you couldn't escape them.
Even a fucking national tragedy helped them out.
It's a strange story. Right after JFK's assassination, all regular programming was suspended. When they finally needed some filler content, a clip of the Beatles performing was ready to go, and it ended up getting broadcast to millions of Americans who were glued to their TVs.
Talk about being in the right place at the right time.
Right.
It was a fucked up twist of fate.
It really was. And then there's the Marsha Albert story.
Oh yeah, the teenager who basically forced, "I want to hold your hand" onto the radio. How'd you pull that off?
She wrote this passionate letter to a DJ named Carol James at WWDC in Washington, D.C.
Begging him to play the song.
Pretty much. She basically said, why the hell don't we have music this good in America?
I love it.
So James, he was intrigued, he played the song, and his switchboard lit up.
The rest is history?
Yeah, that single act set off a chain reaction that spread across the country.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So a 15-year-old girl basically launched Beatlemania in America.
That's the way it looks.
So they drop an album and boom, they're the biggest band in the world.
Well, they already had albums out in the UK, but their first U.S. album, Meet the Beatles, came out a few weeks after Marsha's letter.
And then came the big one, The Ed Sullivan Show.
Yeah.
That was like the Super Bowl of music.
That was huge.
I bet.
Almost half of all U.S. television viewers tuned in to watch the Beatles perform.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a concert. It was a cultural event. Families huddled around their TVs, kids screaming their heads off. It was pure chaos.
That's insane. Can you imagine that kind of mass hysteria today? Everyone's too busy staring at their goddamn phones.
The Ed Sullivan Show basically made the Beatles icons, and their success on the charts just proved it.
They were on fire.
At one point, they held the top 5 spots on the Billboard Hot 100.
5 spots. That's not just winning, that's crushing the competition.
It was a level of dominance that's practically unheard of in music, and it wasn't just a flash in the pan. They ruled the charts for years.
Okay, so the Beatles were the kings, but they weren't the only Brits making waves. There was this whole second wave of bands coming in hot on their heels.
You had bands like the Rolling Stones, the Kinks, the Animals, all bringing something different to the table.
They weren't just copying the Beatles, were they?
No, they were pushing the boundaries of rock and roll in their own ways.
The Stones, they were a different animal.
Yeah, a bit rougher around the edges.
Or dangerous.
Exactly. They weren't singing about holding hands, that's for sure.
So the Beatles were winning hearts. The Stones were tapping into something a bit darker.
Exactly. And that's what's so fascinating about the British invasion. It wasn't just one sound, one style. It was this explosion of creativity that snuck into every corner of American pop culture.
So it wasn't just the music. It was the fashion, the films, the whole damn package.
It was a total cultural takeover.
Those Brits were coming for everything.
It's crazy how some stupid pop songs can turn a whole culture upside down. The British invasion wasn't just about the music. It was like a whole new way of thinking, a whole new way of seeing the world.
Yeah, those Brits were giving the finger to the whole fucking system, and American kids loved it. But let's get serious for a minute. What would have happened to American music if those line-me bastards had stayed home? Would we all be stuck listening to surf rock and Elvis singing about goddamn hound dogs?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's impossible to know for sure, but American music was already changing. The counterculture was starting to grow. People were getting restless and wanted something new. The British invasion just sped things up.
So you're saying it wasn't just the Brits, it was the whole vibe of the time, like a powder keg waiting to explode.
Exactly. They just lit the fuse.
Now that's a fucking image. But let's not forget, this wasn't just about music. Those Brits were coming for everything. So what else did they manage to sneak into American culture?
Oh, we talked about fashion. The mod look with the mini skirts and all that became the uniform for anyone who wanted to rebel.
Mini skirts. I'm all for that. But it wasn't just about the clothes, was it? It was the whole attitude, the whole idea of breaking free.
Exactly. They were rejecting all that uptight conservative bullshit from the older generation. And it wasn't just clothes. British movies started making a splash too. You had films like Alfie and What's New Pussycat, bringing a fresh perspective, a little bit of irony and social commentary that you didn't see in a lot of American films back then.
And of course, we got to talk about the big one. James Bond, Mr. Cool himself.
Bond changed everything. He was a whole new kind of man, smooth, sophisticated, and cool as hell. He wasn't just some tough guy. He was a gentleman spy who could seduce a woman and take down a villain with the same goddamn smirk.
And he did it all with a martini in his hand. Shaken, not stirred. No wonder America went crazy for that shit. But Bond wasn't the only British actor making waves. You had guys like Michael Caine, Peter O'Toole, Peter Sellers, all bringing that British charm to Hollywood.
It was like a British invasion of Hollywood, and it changed the way American films were made. Suddenly, everyone wanted a British accent, and American actors were trying to copy that cool, laid-back style.
So basically, those Brits were everywhere. The music, the clothes, the movies, they took over the whole damn country.
It was total domination. But it wasn't just about the Brits forcing their culture on America. It was more like a mixing of ideas, a blend of influences that created something completely new.
So it was like a collaboration, a team effort to create something bigger and better. But let's be real, not everyone in America was happy about this British takeover. How did American musicians react? Did they just sit back and watch their careers go down the drain, or did they fight back?
It's a mixed bag. Some American artists definitely felt threatened, like their careers were getting screwed over by all this British talent. Genres like surf rock and teen idol pop, which were huge in the early 60s, definitely took a hit. Bands like the Beach Boys and singers like Fabian saw their popularity fade as the British sound took over.
Yeah, who wants to sing about surfing when those British bad boys are singing about love, loss, and revolution? Talk about a tough act to follow.
It wasn't easy for those artists, but some of them, like the Beach Boys, adapted. They started incorporating elements of the British sound into their own music.
Survival of the fittest, right? Change or die. But what about the American bands that actually benefited from the British invasion?
The rise of garage rock is a good example. Bands like The Seeds, The Standells, and a ton of others came out of nowhere, inspired by the raw energy and DIY spirit of the British invasion.
So it wasn't all bad for American music. The British invasion actually helped to make room for a new generation of artists.
Exactly. It didn't destroy American music, it just challenged it, made it better, and pushed it in new directions.
It's crazy how music and national identity get all tangled up. It's not just about the sounds, it's about the stories, the history, the whole sense of who you are.
Absolutely. And in a way, the British invasion forced American artists to figure out what it meant to be American and how that showed up in their music. It was a time for reflection, for figuring things out, and for reinventing themselves.
So even though it felt like an invasion at the time, it actually made American music stronger and more diverse in the long run.
It's funny how things work out. What started as a British thing ended up having a huge impact on American culture, music, and everything else. It was a clash of styles, a clash of cultures, and in the end, it was a fusion of creativity that made both sides better.
So the British invasion had its time in the spotlight, but even the biggest parties have to end sometime. When did this love affair with all things British finally start to fade?
Well, it wasn't like someone flipped a switch and it was over. It was more like things just started cooling down.
The party was winding down.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, America was going through a lot of shit in the late 60s, Vietnam, civil rights, the whole world felt like it was on fire.
Yeah, you can't really stay focused on pop music when the world's going to hell in a handbasket.
Exactly. And so that initial crazy energy of the British invasion, it just naturally faded.
So did those British bands just pack up their shit and slink back home?
Fuck no. They might not have been ruling the charts like they were in 64 and 65, but British musicians were still a huge force in music. They evolved, they tried new things, and they kept on shaping the sound of rock and roll.
So the invasion might have ended, but the Brits never really went away.
Exactly. They just became part of the fabric of music.
And that's one of the big takeaways here, right? The British invasion smashed down the walls between British and American music, and it created this back and forth that's still going on today.
You got it.
I mean, think about it. The punk scene in the 70s with bands like The Clash and the Sex Pistols. And then in the 80s, you had all that synth pop stuff with Duran Duran and Depeche Mode. And who could forget Britpop in the 90s with Blur and Oasis going head to head?
All those movements, in their own way, they were built on what the British invasion started.
They were pushing the boundaries and proving that British music could keep reinventing itself and still connect with American audiences.
For sure. It was like the British invasion planted a seed and it just kept growing.
But did any American bands ever try to fight back? Like a musical Take Back America kind of thing?
Oh yeah, there were definitely some American bands that tried to reclaim that American sound. Bands like Paul Revere and the Raiders with their Revolutionary War outfits and their hard-driving rock and roll, they were like a direct response to the British invasion.
Like they were saying, hold the fuck up, we invented rock and roll, and we're not going to let a bunch of Brits steal our thunder.
Exactly. It was all about taking back that American pride, reclaiming the music that some people felt was being lost. And there were other bands like Gary Puckett and the Union Gap who did similar things, using historical imagery and a more classic rock and roll sound.
It's wild how music can be so tied up with national identity. It's not just the sounds, it's the stories, the history, the feeling of belonging to something bigger.
It really is. And the British invasion kind of forced American artists to think about those things. What did it mean to be American? How did that show up in their music? It was a time for looking inward, for figuring things out, and for starting fresh.
So even though it felt like an invasion back then, it actually ended up making American music stronger and more interesting in the end.
It's funny how that works out. What started as a British thing ended up changing American culture, music, and a whole lot more. It was a clash of styles, a clash of cultures, but in the end, it created something new and exciting that made both sides better.
All right, so there you have it, folks. The British invasion. A musical revolution, a cultural phenomenon, and a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes come from the most unexpected places. It was a time of chaos, of trying new things, and most importantly, of amazing music that still kicks ass today. And who knows, maybe there's another invasion brewing out there ready to shake things up all over again.